Hello and welcome to Wendy's Workshop. Today I'm excited to share with you my mini junk journal and some fun ways to use the Rina Electro-Pop Neon Flock and Electro-Pop Neon Glitz to embellish the cover. We'll create this journal from scratch together using a few other ThermOWeb products and then we'll embellish it. Let's go ahead and jump on in. I created my cover using a piece of mat board that I had left over from another project. I then cut a piece of canvas fabric large enough to leave a 1-inch border all the way around. Each piece of the chipboard cover measures 3.5 inches by 5.5 inches, and the binding piece is about 1/2 inch wide. I decided to try adhering the cover fabric to the chipboard using HeatnBond. I have to say that this is my new favorite way to adhere over a large surface. In the past, I've used liquid adhesive, which leaves the mat board wet and causes it to buckle a bit, or spray adhesive, which is really messy and has to be done outside. This was fast, easy, and left my cover with a smooth and crisp finish. To do this, cut a piece of HeatnBond slightly smaller than your fabric piece. I use the Ultrahold. When you look at the HeatnBond, you can see which side has the adhesive on it because it's a little shiny. That is the side you want to place against your fabric. Now make sure that you place it on the inside of your fabric if there's a difference. I put a paper towel down underneath mine, and because I'm using my craft iron, I didn't bother to put anything on top. Set your iron to medium, no steam, and iron over the paper side of the HeatnBond. You can kind of tell when the adhesive starts to grab on, and you can check it by trying to lift a corner to see if it comes up. Once it is adhered and cooled to the touch, go ahead and peel off the release paper. You can see that the fabric is now shiny where there is a thin layer of adhesive over the entire surface. Now I'm not sure for this next step if this is the best way to do it since it was my first go at it, but this is how I did it. If you have a better way that you've experienced, please share it in the comments below. I put a small piece of Gina Terrific tape on each chipboard piece just to hold it in place while I do the ironing. And then I mitered the fabric corners. I then pulled one end of the fabric as tight as possible and held it while I ironed the top. Once I could feel the top start to adhere, I then held it up and ironed the edge as well. This part is just a little bit tricky, but once you do it on one side, the other three are really easy. So once I had all of those down, and because I'm adhering fabric to paper and not fabric to fabric, I went over all of the inside flaps one more time just to make sure they were completely adhered, and then I flipped it over and I ironed the outside cover as well. The very last thing I did was to hold the iron to each corner just to make sure the corners were also adhered. Now let's go ahead and start the cover. I'm going to start by laying down a little bit of blue watercolor paint, leaving a clean border around the edges. I'm using 3 different shades of blue, and I built up the color as I went. If you don't have watercolor paints, you could do this with watered down craft paints or any water-soluble pigment. You'll want to dry it with a heat tool or wait for it to dry completely to move on to the next step. Now before I started my video, I die cut a bunch of flowers from the Deco Foil foam adhesive using the iCraft Floral Garden dies. I wasn't sure how many I would use, but I didn't want to have to stop and cut more, so I cut a bunch. If you don't have a die cutting system, the foam adhesive is really easy to cut with scissors. The first step in coloring my foam flowers will be applying the Rina Electro-Pop Neon Flock to the sticky surface. Simply peel the release paper from one side of the foam and press the piece of flock transfer paper, flock side down, onto the flower and burnish it. You can see my idea of burnishing is apparently to just press it with my fingers. Peel the flower away from the flock transfer sheet and you now have a perfectly flock flower. If, however, you have any bits of adhesive with no flock, simply press it against the flock sheet again to pick up a little bit more flock. And I'm going to go ahead and start adhering the flowers one at a time to my cover and flocking them as I go. Here you can see I'm doing the first one, which is a light pink one, and you can see it comes out perfectly flocked. Next, I'm going to give this flower a yellow flocked center. And because I'm sticking this piece of foam onto an already flocked surface, I want to make sure that it adheres well. So I am using some fabric fused liquid adhesive off camera before I adhere it. This will ensure that the adhesive soaks into that flock and doesn't pop off later. So I'm going to go ahead and continue adding the flocking to the flowers off camera, and I'm going to come back once I have them all attached to the front of my cover. Okay, you can see my cover is ready for the next step. And while these flocked flowers are pretty as is, I want to add a bit more depth so the color isn't so one-dimensional. To do that, I'm going to use the same watercolors I used to paint the cover. I will use the same color as the flower in a deeper shade than the flock to color the center of the flowers, fading out towards the end of the petals. In the areas where I get a little too much paint, I can easily add water and use a towel to dab it off because the flock does act a little bit like fabric. I'm going to go ahead and paint all of the flowers off camera, and then we're going to come back and finish. So with my flowers painted, now I want to add just a bit of glitz, some Rina Electro-Pop neon glitz to be exact. Using a paintbrush to apply, I'm simply going to go over the painted areas just to give them a little something extra. I'm going to do this with each color. I love that while the glitz brightens the flowers back up, I don't lose any of that color depth that I got by adding the paint. Now at this point, I want to take a small time out just to share some experimenting that I did during this project. While I didn't end up using any of the Rina Electro-Pop neon enamel transfer sheets on my project, I did play with embossing them. And here's what I found. I have 3 different samples, all embossed with the same embossing folder. However, any all-over pattern would work for these techniques. For the first one, I used black paint on the shiny side and just wiped it off, leaving it inside of the crevices. For the second one, I embossed it and then I sanded the raised surface with a nail file. On the last one, after embossing it, I dragged a white hybrid ink pad over the matte side and it left it with almost a metallic look over that raised surface. I would encourage you to play with all of these surfaces. They are so versatile and can be used in so many different ways. All right, let's finish up the journal. I used Ultra Bond liquid adhesive to adhere the paper to the inside covers. The Ultra Bond adheres nicely to both the fabric and the mat board. I was afraid that I was going to need to go back and use fabric fuse, but since one of the surfaces was paper, it really does have a strong bond. Now I created the entire inside of this mini junk journal and I added beads to the spine, all without realizing that my memory was full and it had stopped recording. So I'm sure this video would have been too long with all of that anyway. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what I did. I created 2 small signatures using various scraps of folded paper. I simply tied the signatures to the binding to secure them. Nothing fancy here. Once I tied the ribbon on the outside binding, I strung a few beads on just to give it a finished look, and that was it. Now, while most people would have stopped right here, and maybe I should have, I decided I wanted to doodle all over the cover as well. So with a black pen, I started doodling and found that the line was a little too faint, so I did find a Sharpie so that I could darken it up a bit. As I was doing that, I added even more doodles to it and kind of just kept going. Once it was all good and doodled up, I was finally ready to call it finished. So here is my finished journal. Thank you so much for joining me on the ThermOWeb blog and channel today. I hope this inspires you to play around with your products. There's always a way to take it just one step further.